Richard Thaler, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
I really look forward to this conversation. Let's take a couple of steps back. Your big contribution is in the field of behavioral economics, and it comes against a background that is often invoked, but perhaps a lot less true today as a result of your work, of economics making a bunch of assumptions about people acting in rational ways. To those of my listeners who have not taken Econ 101 or who took Econ 101 too long ago, to have as present in the mind, what kind of assumptions are we talking about when we're saying that economics, at one point in time, assumed that people would behave in these rational ways?
Yeah, I don't even think we have to add the at one point in time. Economics, as traditionally done, and more or less as still done, is a theory of maximizing agents. And what distinguishes economics from other social science disciplines is precisely that assumption, that the agents in the economy, and economists actually use that word, agents. You won't find the word people in an economics textbook. So there are agents, and these agents are consumers and workers and employers and government officials, and they all solve any problem by solving for the best possible outcome. Now, there are some additional assumptions, more or less for convenience, such as that people are selfish, don't care at all about others. That's a core assumption, but not at the heart of economics, though it's often assumed, and all of this, of course, is counterfactual.
Now, I think the point of some of these assumptions and the point also of more formal rational choice models, which often hinge on those assumptions, is sometimes insufficiently understood, right? This is not necessarily that economists say that people act in these ways all of the time, or that political scientists who've increasingly started to incorporate rational choice models into their work as well think that under all circumstances, political leaders or individual voters or citizens act in a rational way. It's the hope, it's the idea that by making some very simple assumptions about the world, you can explain a large percentage of it, right? That with a few simple assumptions, you don't get 100% of the way to the truth, but you might get 95% of the truth. So it's a really good first approximation as to what could happen, how to understand the world. Do you still find those assumptions useful in that kind of way? And sort of when, to what extent, under what kind of circumstances should we deviate from that assumption in trying to understand the social world?
Well, Milton Friedman in the 60s, I think, famously argued that it didn't matter if people were incapable of solving these problems as long as they behaved as if they were doing that. Those two words, as if. And economists justified what they were doing for a long time with those two words. And the first paper I wrote that in what's now called behavioral economics in 1980, I took on those two words and said, no, they don't. And Friedman had a famous analogy. He said, suppose we look at a professional billiards player. The billiards player doesn't know trigonometry and physics and all the things that would be necessary to actually solve, but acts as if he or she did. And my response to that is, well, in economics, we're not limiting ourselves to professionals. So suppose we go into a pub and there's two guys playing pool. What are they going to do? Well, they're probably going to aim at a ball that is closest to a pocket, with an idea that they're taking the shot that's most likely to work. They often miss. They're not thinking more than one step ahead, whereas a professional would be thinking 3 shots ahead. And so the model would just be wrong. And if we think about something like the model for people saving for retirement, that's enormously complicated. Somebody in their 40s is assumed to be calculating more or less accurately their future lifetime income, how much they would need to save to smooth over their lifetime, invest properly, and so forth and so on. This is kind of a preposterous assumption. And it's those models are still useful. I think they're useful as normative models, that is, models of the way you should behave. So if you go to a financial advisor, that person's job is to help you do that. How much do you want to give to your heirs? How well do you want to live in retirement? Blah, blah, blah. Solve. And there's software to do that. But the idea that people are doing that in their head is ridiculous. And it's also leaving out self-control problems. So in order to implement that plan, I can't get tempted by some new sports car or a posh trip to Italy to eat some good food. So no, the models are useful to say how agents that don't exist would solve, but then it's an empirical question whether those models work.
So some of this now seems obvious thanks to your work and the work of others in the field of behavioral economics, but they must not have felt at all obvious when you set out on doing this work. What first set you off on that? How did you look at this line saying, people act as if they were rational agents in this kind of way and think that smells wrong? Was that a particular observation about the empirical world in a particular field of economics? Was it just a general sense of, people as I've experienced them in the world aren't anything like that? Why do we keep assuming this? Did you come in with a kind of critical mindset about standard economics, or were you at first taken in by it? How did you sort of get towards that avenue of research?
I think it started when I was in graduate school, and I like to say I was the first economist who bothered to look out the window, possibly because I was bored with the lectures. But
you kind of been the first economist to be bored by the lectures.
No, that's right. But maybe they were daydreaming about something else. And yeah, it started. I had a list of funny behavior, dumb stuff people do that I thought illustrated important points.
What was on the list?
So there's a now well-known story about I had a dinner party and there was some roast in the oven, and over some adult beverages, I brought out a large bowl of cashew nuts, and people started nibbling that with their cocktails, and the bowl started to disappear, and I was worried about our appetites. So I grabbed the bowl and hid it in the kitchen. And this was a group of economists. And when I came back, everyone thanked me. Oh, thank God you got rid of those cashews. We were going to eat them. And then, it being a dinner of economists, the conversation became very boring and technical. Well, actually, we're not allowed to be happy about that. because we
We're supposed to be rational agents. How
Right.
can taking away a choice make us better off?
Exactly. So, and then, I had another story about what economists.
I think perhaps revealed preference here is truer than stated preference. I think cashew nuts are just superior to a roast. That is my solution to this problem. But
Yeah, well, but it's an asset allocation problem, right? I mean, so some cashew nuts, but maybe you'd like to consume both, and I think the consensus at the table was that our cashew to roast ratio was going to be incorrect. And look, we've all had the experience of deciding after the fact that the alcohol consumption was greater than optimum after the fact. So, but yeah, another one of these early examples was about what economists call the sunk cost fallacy, SUNK. And the idea is that if you've paid for something, the amount you paid for it is gone and is not recoverable, and therefore you should ignore it in future decisions. So here's an example. You paid a significant amount of money to attend some concert, and that evening you get a text from a friend whose flight has been canceled, was changing planes in Chicago or wherever you're living, and says, "I'm free for dinner. Are you?" And let's assume that if on any other night of the year you were given a choice of going to that concert or seeing your friend who you see only occasionally, you would say that's a no-brainer. But many people would make the mistake of saying, well, I paid all that money.
I paid for the
that.
damn tickets. I can't forgo them, right? It's
Right.
wasting money. It's somehow more painful.
Exactly. So I had this list, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. And then I discovered the work of the psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. We're in the mid-1970s at this point, and they had a big idea, which was that when dealing with complicated problems, people take mental shortcuts, which is entirely sensible, but those shortcuts lead to systematic deviations from the rational economic model, like the two that we've just mentioned. And there's a guy called Herbert Simon who was a behavioral economist before the term existed and got fed up with debating with economists and he was a pioneer in artificial intelligence instead, maybe a better goal. But he had the idea, well, people satisfice. That is, they don't try to solve some problem. They figure out some solution that's good enough and quit, which is entirely sensible. But economists more or less ignored him. He was given a Nobel Prize, but that means he impressed 7 Swedes. It doesn't mean that he necessarily impressed the profession. And I think the reason for that is that they didn't know what to do with him. If you add an error term to a model and the errors add up to 0, then economists say, fine. Yeah, we never thought people were perfect. It's if the model makes specific if the model mispredicts behavior.
Let me see whether I understand this. So the idea is that when you're satisficing, you're saying, I'm just going to operate at a rough approximation of a solution. But those approximations, at least as he demonstrated them, don't necessarily go off in one direction or the other direction. It means that
Right.
you don't get you don't get a very detailed answer, and you might sometimes be off 5 points in one direction, sometimes 5 points in the other direction. But since it doesn't systematically bias your estimates of what's going to happen, economists felt like, interesting point, well-deserved Nobel Prize, but we can kind of ignore that. And so in order to actually change your profession, you needed to find examples of where there's mental shortcuts or there's ways in which we aren't acting in a rational way, systematically make us choose something that's different from what the model suggests. Is that the idea?
That's right. So here's an example from this early Kahneman and Tversky work. They said, and this work was not about decisions, it was about judgments, about forecasts. And suppose I say to you, in the United States, what's the ratio of deaths by homicide to deaths by suicide? And most people will say homicides may be twice as likely as suicides, and the opposite is true. So there are about twice as many suicides. And Kahneman and Tversky said, well, that's because they use what they called the availability heuristic. That is, we estimate something's likelihood by how easy it is to recall instances of that.
Homicide. And since murders are much more covered in the news than suicides, they're much more available to us when we're looking for these examples.
And this is, notice, this it's interesting. This is in spite of the fact that at least for people in our socioeconomic class, we almost certainly know more people who committed suicide than died by homicide. So there's a different lens that we could have looked in that even with availability would have got this right. But it's sort of the news bias that creates this. But anyway, you can see that. So I read those papers and I got all excited and said, "Wait, here we go. There's a way of doing this that can't be ignored." And that's the beginning.
And what's interesting is that you obviously ended up collaborating with them in various ways, but they were mostly looking at social psychology more broadly, and some of the examples they were giving were economic or had applications to economics. But you then built on that to show that, in a broad range of economic situations, we don't act rationally, and including actually sometimes in very sophisticated economic actors, not just the average employee who doesn't like to think about economics too much, who's choosing some random retirement plan and perhaps isn't maximizing, the way in which we're going to smooth income over time. But some pretty sophisticated actors in the economy end up deviating from expectations of rationality as well. Tell us about some of those examples in economics.
Sure. So, well, as you know, I recently published a newish book that with the title "The Winner's Curse," and this won't be just an entirely a plug for this book, but yeah.
You're allowed a few plugs for this book. I mean, I understand that if podcast guests are being somewhat rational, they're going to agree to come on in part to be able to plug the book. So you're only acting rationally by making the plugs. And I'm acting rationally by allowing you a few plugs to encourage other podcast guests to come back on the show. Okay,
so economic theory is exactly right, as I've always said. So let me start over and say something about that book because it sort of helps put this all in history. Sometime in the mid-1980s, I was offered the opportunity to start writing a quarterly column in a brand new economics journal called the Journal of Economic Perspectives, a journal that still exists and is the only economics journal that is accessible to non-economists. And that journal is still exists and is free to anybody, by the way. And the column I was asked to write was on anomalies, right? So these are departures from economic theory. And I did that for 4 years. And when I had enough that looked like a book, I sort of stapled those together and had a book that was called The Winner's Curse. And we'll get to what the winner's curse is in a minute. But these were empirical facts that are embarrassing to economists. So recently, I collaborated with a young co-author to go back and look at those old columns and say, hey, are those true? Some of those, many of the early ones were based on experiments, kind of motivated by psychologists, laboratory experiments with undergrads at low stakes. And there's something that's called the replication crisis in some parts of psychology. Is there a replication crisis in behavioral economics? And what we've shown in this new book is there was no replication crisis in this field, and that many of the early studies based on students running experiments have now been replicated with experts doing something for a living. So let's take the example of the title chapter of that book, The Winner's Curse. So what is the winner's curse? The idea is in an auction that the winner gets something that's worth the same to everyone. It's often the case that the high bidder, the winner of the auction, loses money. So here's a simple lab experiment you can run, or classroom experiment. You fill a jar with coins. You count them. You say let's say you have $75 worth of coins. You auction off the jar. The high bidder wins that amount of money. They don't have to take the coins. What happens? Well, the average bid is conservative, so it might be $40. But the winning bid is almost always more than $75. So the winner is cursed. Now, this was not discovered by psychologists or by renegade economists. It was discovered by engineers at Atlantic Richfield Oil Company who were drilling for oil in what I stubbornly continue to call the Gulf of Mexico. And what they noticed was, there were, hundreds of plots that were divvied up. They bid for lots of them. And the ones that they won, there was usually less oil than their geologists had predicted. And they were trying to think, what's going on here? Do we have lousy geologists? Are we just unlucky? And then what they realized was, oh, wait a minute. The bids we win are not a random set of bids.
Right. It's the bids where we're being relatively optimistic relative to the guesses that everybody else makes.
Exactly.
And we might have bet on 90 other oil fields, but on each of those oil fields, we were on the money or we were below what the true yield was. But of course, those were the bids that we didn't win.
Right. Compare the strategy of hiring experts and trying to figure out the optimal bid for each one with another strategy of bid $1 for every plot. You'll win some.
Right.
And you'll never overpay. A friend of mine and I used to bid in wine auctions, and that was the strategy we used, of making very low bids. And there was one auction where in L.A. and there were some demonstrations, and people couldn't show up at the physical site, and our bids that had been faxed. This is an old story. We ended up with quite a lot of very good, inexpensive wine as a result. So that's what a smart strategic bidder does to overcome the winner's curse. But
explain to me where the irrationality lies here, right? Because in itself, hiring the best experts to make bids is not irrational. And it doesn't sound like there were psychological biases going on here, right? Like the bias of the bidders was not, as you might expect from some of the Kahneman examples, that this oil field has been in the news a lot, or it has a name that makes it sound really winning, or whatever else. I'm confident about this. I'm going to put a lot of money in, like the way I might put a lot of money on a horse because it reminds me of some lucky word or something like that, right? But the structure of the auction is such that obviously, if 10 really smart people make an estimate, it's natural that there's going to be some spread between the estimates, even if each of them is acting rationally. So it's kind of like a second order irrationality, right? The irrationality lay in not recognizing the structural feature of a market and adjusting what otherwise would seem like a very reasonable approach to it as a result. The bid itself wasn't irrational. It was the overall strategy of bidding, given that you would only win the auctions in the instances when you were higher than everybody else.
Yeah, no, that's right. So maybe let's compare it with a famous example from Keynes. So John Maynard Keynes, one of the great 20th century economists, in his famous book, The General Theory, offered a very sexist example from the time. The newspapers used to run contests where there would be photographs of 100 attractive women, and the contestants, presumably nearly all of whom were men, on the train, I'm always visualized them looking at their newspaper, and the job was to pick the 5 that would be judged the prettiest by everyone else. And Keynes said this is his model of the stock market. The goal is not to correctly say who are the prettiest. It's to say who others will think are the prettiest. Or as Keynes said, it's actually who others will think, others will think, others will think. Now, here's a version of this, a little game that economists now call the beauty contest game in honor of Keynes. We say, everybody in this room, we imagine we have 100 people in a room. We're going to guess a number from 0 to 100 with the goal of guessing as close as possible to 2/3 of the average guess. Okay? So we look around the room. We say these guys are mostly asleep. I'm not paying that much attention. Maybe they'll just guess at random. If people guess at random, their average guess will be 50, so we should guess 2/3 of that, which is 33. And then we say, oh, wait, maybe some people are awake, and they've realized that they should guess 33, so I should guess 22. But of course, maybe some people think that. And now the question is, how many steps do people take? So the rational economic model of this guessing game, Nash equilibrium, is guess 0. Because let's say everyone guesses 3, well, you want to guess 2. If everyone guesses 2, you want to guess 1.3. Right? So now I've played this game dozens of times. I can tell you 0 has never won. I played this game in the Financial Times with 2 business class tickets, London to the U.S., offered to the winner. And I think the winning guess was 13.
So you go some way towards that. You realize some of the logic, but you don't go all the way towards that. Because, and why is that? Is that because some people don't understand the logic of a game and so they don't go there? Or is it because you're expecting that some people won't fully follow the logic of that, and so therefore it's rational not, seemingly it's rational to go to 0, assuming that everybody else is rational. But if rightly you assume that everybody else is not rational, then guessing 0 is in fact irrational, and guessing somewhere in the middle is a little bit better.
Right. And what you guess depends greatly on who you're playing with.
Right.
So if I play that with University of Chicago MBA students, then a number in the low teens is a good guess. I played this in my granddaughter's high school economics class, and a number in the 20s won. She submitted it, and everyone thought that it was rigged. But,
she's just listened to you at the dinner table too often.
Yeah, I guess.
Right. So there is a nice story that I think vastly oversimplifies the state of research, that you can have people play a prisoner's dilemma game. If you want to listen back to what a prisoner's dilemma is, Steven Pinker and I discuss it at some detail in the recent podcast I had with him. But the idea is that most people in the world don't in fact act as instructed by the prisoner's dilemma, and there's been lots of studies of people all over the world in different cultures, different professional status, and by and large people don't really behave like a prisoner's dilemma predicts, except apparently, and this may be somewhat apocryphal, economics grad students who reliably act as a prisoner's dilemma instructs them to, and therefore find it much harder to cooperate with each other than any other group of humans.
That's a somewhat controversial finding, but yes, that's approximately right. And now, one of the things that we've done in this book is, again, let's get outside the lab, and how do we raise the stakes? I've managed to write 3 academic papers using data from game shows. And there's a delightful UK game show with the odd title Golden Balls that ends with a high-stakes prisoner's dilemma. They call it split or steal. So there are 2 people, and they've won some money, and they each can say split or steal. If they both split, they split. If one steals and the other splits, the one who steals gets everything. If they both steal, they both get nothing. You can find 2 really interesting episodes on YouTube. One for £100,000. So this is well beyond the research budget of most universities. I won't spoil the ending. Look for an episode.
I believe that one person, I don't know if that's the one you mean, but one person's, normally the way this goes is that people reassure each other that of course I'm going to split, right? Trust me, of course I'm going to be the good upstanding citizen. And then sometimes when they're relatively sure that the other person has been induced by their assurances to be the good upstanding citizen and to split, they secretly steal and they get all of the money. And here somebody inverts the strategy. I know that's the episode you're thinking about, and saying, I'm going to steal. Whatever you do, I'm going to steal. And it leads to a hilarious outcome.
Yes, that episode is priceless. He kind of broke the game. But everyone else sort of played by the rules. And the behavior is just exactly the same. There's about a little bit more cooperation in that game than in a laboratory experiment for $10. And so, yeah. So there's another old economics game called the ultimatum game, where you and I are asked to share $100, say, and The rules are I make you an offer which you can accept or reject. If you accept, you get what I offered. If you reject, we both get nothing. Economic theory says, well, you'll take anything, so I should offer you $1 or maybe a penny. But real people find low offers insulting. So the results of that game are offers of less than 20% are usually rejected. Profit maximizing offers about 40%. And again, that game, the results don't change if you multiply the stakes by 10 or 100 or go to some poor country where you can afford to pay for a month's wage.
So, we've done a really great tour d'horizon of the different kinds of ways in which economists once upon a time assumed that people behave rationally. Perhaps some economists still assume that people behave rationally. But in fact, we see in these lab experiments, we see in behaviors on game shows, we see in the way in which people bid on oil fields that they don't behave as rationally as was assumed. What are the implications of that for economics, and what are the implications of that for public policy? Presumably one of the things that might change, and this is where your work with another recent podcast guest, Sunstein, comes in, is that if we assume that people make rational choices, then all we need to do is to offer them a bunch of fair choices, for example, about where to invest their retirement, whether to save for their retirements, and then it's up to them. If we recognize that people are likely to make choices that are irrational in a variety of ways that really are detrimental to their well-being, then we might start to think, well, can we manipulate the choice architecture in some way? Can we nudge them in some way towards the right course of action, such that they still have freedom of choice, they can still decline the nudge, but we end up with many more people saving adequately for the retirement, for example. Talk us a little bit through the variety of implications of this research, including perhaps your influential book on nudging with Sunstein.
Sure. So let's take the following example. There, listeners who are not from America have read about the horrors of the U.S. healthcare system, and it is pretty horrible. We spend more than anyone else and get kind of average care. But the system is also very complicated. And there was one company that decided that there was probably some economist who worked for them and said, look, here they offered health insurance to their workers, and there are 4 variables that you could choose, how big the deductible is and stuff like that. I won't bore with the details. Think of it as like a restaurant. How many courses, and do you want fish or meat, and how many desserts, right? Think of it like that. And they gave them every possible option and said, pick one. There were 48 combinations. Now, it turns out that many of these options were dominated by one of the alternatives. Dominated meaning that there was an option that was guaranteed to cost less no matter how much health care you consumed. Now, a rational agent will start by eliminating all the dominated options. In fact, that in game theory, that's an explicit assumption. Oh, well, what agents are going to do is cross out the ones they absolutely shouldn't take and then pick one of the others. But now, remember, this is not an experiment. This is something a company did with 25,000 employees. And more than half chose dominated options.
So they were just leaving money on the table. They could have done some combinations of choices that just would have meant less money paid up front and less money, even if you get sick, etc.
The average household spent at least $400 too much, and possibly more depending on how much healthcare they consumed. So, right. So that shows sort of a blunt way that if you give people a complicated problem, they don't solve. And giving people all the options isn't a good way to do it. It would be like going back to the restaurant example. You wouldn't go to a restaurant where they give you a list of all of their ingredients. Right? That would be horrible.
Right. Here's what's in the fridge.
Right. Yeah.
Tell us what to do.
Yes. Right. No, you want to. The best dinner is, here are 5 things you would never have dreamed of ordering, and watch what we do and taste what we do. So the book Cass Sunstein and I wrote, called Nudge, originally in 2008, and then we did an update that we called the final edition, a title I insisted on to prevent Cass from rewriting
insisting on meeting his yearly quota of new books by forcing you to do another update.
You mean quarterly quota. So, yeah, we suggested, maybe for hard problems, you should give people some help. And so certainly I would have eliminated all the dominated options in that plan if they hired me as the consultant. Now, the irony is they used one of our favorite tricks. They did offer a default plan. If you don't make a choice, here's a plan. But people didn't take it. And I think the reason is, it's like going to a salad bar and saying, no, and composing a Caesar salad. You're sort of, well, wait, no, you're there, and you're sort of being nudged to do it yourself.
You feel like the point of a place is to make all of these choices yourself, and in the end, you end up with pineapple in your pizza.
Right. So anyway, our book was to say there are many places where we can help people make better choices. The example we like to talk about is GPS. So, and when we wrote the book, we did not we each had just bought our first iPhones, and we didn't have GPS in our pocket. I'm very geographically challenged, so having GPS in my pocket is very good for me. And what we would like is life to be more like wandering around in a strange city with GPS in your pocket. So if I had worked at that company, I would have liked an app that would have, and maybe now ChatGPT with the right prompts, you feed that thing in and give it a little nudge, the AI, and say, can you help me choose here? And a good one would start by eliminating the dominated options. And so our book is full of ways in which we can make the world more like wandering around the streets of a strange city with GPS in your pocket, rather than one of those old maps that I couldn't even figure out how to refold, much less navigate.
I just went through a great American annual tradition of having to choose my benefits for the upcoming year, and there was many windows about whether or not I should spend $4.74 per pay period to get some kind of accident insurance and all kinds of other questions, all of which are outsourced to ChatGPT. I have no idea whether or not ChatGPT gave me good answers or not, but it certainly, I think, was rational to spend more of my time thinking about the world and less of my time making those low-stakes decisions. So
here's some free advice to your listeners. Decline all extended warranties. There you go. Free.
All right. Excellent. The other point I want to make is that I have a long-standing theory that the only invention of the last 30 years that is not just a net good for humanity, but I think virtually a costless gain for humanity is Google Maps. I remember so many stressful car drives as a child where either you were looking at a map and you forgot where exactly you are on the map and you'd have to stop and ask 7 people and you had no idea when you'd arrive. Or later when there was MapQuest and you'd have what I think was an even worse equilibrium, these kind of step-by-step instructions. And if you managed on a long drive to follow all of the instructions exactly,
right,
then you were golden. But inevitably you would miss one of those turns. And at that point, you might not even have a map in your hands and you would just be completely lost. And I think that led to a lot of fights between couples, for example. I think this kind of, it's not just that Google Maps means that people now on average arrive faster because they're less likely to take a wrong turn. I wouldn't be surprised if it leads to somewhat fewer accidents because you're not sort of last second saying, no, this is the exit, and sort of trying to get over to the exit last second. But just the domestic tranquility it buys to just follow these instructions. I think of all of the different inventions over the last 30, 40 years, if there was a Nobel Prize for inventions, this one should get it.
I absolutely agree. And that's why I always use it as the metaphor for what we would like to do to the rest of life.
So some of the other examples you give is, for example, that, when there's free money on the table where your employer contributes significant income to you if you, put a minimum amount of money into retirement savings, a lot of employees don't do that unless there's a default setting. So that's another kind of area in which just having that nudge, saying you can opt out if for whatever financial reasons you really don't want to spend that 3 or 4% of salary pre-tax in a particular, you can opt out. But, all of it is organized employees who just haven't fought through it and who haven't gotten around to making their selection. They should be opted in. There's a nudge towards participating in this program. And if for some reason you choose to opt out, then you're free to do so. And there's many other examples. I mean, with health insurance, right, an employer that offers health insurance should nudge you into being opted into the health insurance. So that if you forget to sign up, you don't suddenly find yourself without health insurance. Even though if you have different kind of health insurance coverage, you certainly should be able to opt out in a proactive way. One way that you describe this is as a form of libertarian paternalism. So there's a paternalistic element, which is saying we kind of know what's right for you here under most circumstances. We know that most people are going to want to save some money for retirement. We know that most of our employees are not going to want to be without health insurance. So we nudge you in that direction. But there's a libertarian element because it's a defeasible pre-selection. You can opt out of those kinds of things. And so it seems to solve a long-standing problem in ethics. That on the one hand, we realize that people often make bad choices and we want to intervene in order to improve their lives. And on the other hand, we might think, but who are we as the state to tell people how to live? Shouldn't people be able to make their own choices? This seems to be a kind of appealing middle ground. Now, of course, it also relies on a background assumption about a pretty competent state and a pretty benevolent government, about experts who sort of know what's good for you. And we're in a moment where there is sometimes wrongly and sometimes perhaps rightly a lot of skepticism about all of those things. How do you think, not just some of the specific empirical examples that I'm personally less interested in, but this kind of framework of how to improve the world fares in the year of 2025 with a particular government we have in the United States, with the governments we have in waiting in other kinds of countries? Do you think that the ethical appeal of this idea of, libertarian paternalism remains as strong? Or do you think in an age where people have these fundamental concerns about expertise, about the government, about the reliability of those who are in government, we should grow a little bit more skeptical about that paradigm?
Well, one of the things that we feel comfortable about that agenda is that we have critics on both sides. So, yeah, you can sketch an argument, as you just did, that if we have authoritarian and, in the United States, obviously incompetent government, do we want to give them more power? On the other hand, we have critics who say that we've been too wimpy, that we should not stop at nudging, we should mandate. And, my response to those critics is to say, really? During the first Trump term, I would ask them, are they aware of who's president? And do they really want to give them more power? So, and look, even if we have competent governments make mistakes. So we view the opt-out feature as an insurance policy. The choice architect, and the choice architect needn't be the government. It could be the employer, right? It's the engineers at Google Maps are deciding how to devise that best route. And what's the trade-off between saving time and making turns every block? My impression is that they've improved that app a bit over the years toward less. I don't need to make 12 turns to save 1 minute. Fine, I'll stop at a few lights. So, there are other critics who view all nudging as kind of evil, and we should boost instead of nudge. I don't know exactly what the difference is, but I think part of it is meant to be education. If we go back to that health insurance example, what are we going to do? Give people a PhD in economics and to enable them to solve that problem? I don't think so. I'm always in favor of making it easier. That's my goal for all of these policies, is to make it easier for people to choose the option that's best for them. Sometimes the solution to that will be to create a default. It's not the only one. Here's a counterexample, and one where people think they know what policy Cass and I prefer and are wrong. And that's organ
All right, test me.
Organ donations. What do you think are...
Well, I've read enough of your work that I know the answer, unfortunately.
Right.
But I guess you would think that the naive reader of Nudge might think, well, obviously they're going to want you to opt in to organ donations because it's really important that we have enough organs to save people whose life might be saved by it. But because relatives at the point of decision still get a word, if they don't feel like my relative who's had this horrible car accident really thought this through, and we're not sure about whether they really would have wanted to, they can override that choice in the end. And so that's why the original nudge architecture doesn't work. And therefore we should do what instead, Richard?
Right. Excellent. A+ answer. So, in fact, the default does work in the sense that if the default is to become an organ donor, almost no one opts out, but that doesn't save any lives because the family members are told, well, your loved one didn't opt out of being an organ donor, so don't you think we should go with his or her wishes? What wishes? So we prefer prompted choice. Ask people when they renew their driver's license, would you like to be an organ donor? Keep asking until they say yes, then stop asking. And then in the U.S., there's a rule called first-person consent, which means the person who made a choice, their wishes count. And so that's the choice architecture we prefer. It's also the one that saves the most lives. But in the UK, one of the very first meetings I had after the Cameron coalition government was elected, we discussed this topic in number 10 and decided not to adopt this presumed consent rule. And then sometime later, in one, I think maybe during the Boris era, they switched to what we think is a worse policy, and people blame me. And I say, don't blame me.
We were joking earlier about ChatGPT, but it occurs to me that as I was going through these 23 or so screens to make my choices of various benefit options and various additional things that I can opt into and so on, which range from key questions like health insurance to some kind of special commuter account where you have to figure out whether or not you're actually going to use it and are going to be actually submitting it. And, if it's not used up, then you lose it. And so on the one hand, it's rational to put a bunch of money in because it's going to save you money because it's pre-tax, so you're not taxed on the money that goes into it. On the other hand, there's a chance that you're not going to use it up, in which case you lose all of it. And it's not high stakes, but it's pretty complicated. There is a preset option that the interface gives me, right? So I don't know if that was always the case or that's a result of nudge, but they do nudge you towards some option or another. It's not that there's sort of free tick boxes without anything pre-selected. Well, if you just click next, it sort of has one. And now, basically, on a lot of these screens, what I did was to copy and paste it into ChatGPT and say, what shall I do? So actually, ChatGPT has become, for a lot of these things, the kind of nudger in chief. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Do you think that ChatGPT, on the whole, is going to be better at prompting us in the right decisions than the preset nudges? Is there things that OpenAI and other AI companies should do to make sure that those AI systems actually nudge us in a healthy rather than unhealthy direction? How is nudging transformed in the age of AI?
Yeah. Well, you really should invite my young co-author, Alex Emis, to do an interview with you, who knows 1,000 times more about AI than me. And I think certainly AI has the potential to help a lot, but you would want to tell it a lot about your preferences. And so I have a friend who's an active AI user who has had ChatGPT read all of his emails and learn as much about him as possible in order to help him be a better version of himself. So, we're so new into this. Yes, it certainly has the possibility to help, but it also can hallucinate. And I would want it asking me the right questions. And, I think, there's a lot of talk about regulation of AI, which is not a topic that I'm qualified to talk about. But I do think that what we absolutely need is AI to be auditable. Meaning it should be possible for us to give it like tests and see what it does. And then certainly AI could be very helpful at choosing the right health insurance options is not harder than navigating a route from New York to Chicago.
Tell us where we're at in terms of incorporating the insights of behavioral economics, both into the profession itself and perhaps into broader life. I think when a research program in academia is successful, it's always hard to remember how revolutionary and insurgent it was. And certainly, I imagine that when he set out in some of his work, there would have been a lot of raised eyebrows and worse. There would have been people saying, "What are you doing? You're really eating away at one of the foundations of a profession." People being rather displeased with some of your research. Now, behavioral economics is a well-recognized subfield of economics. It's well recognized that it has very important contributions to offer. At the same time, as you're pointing out, the fundamental assumptions that economists start with often remains that agents are rational and profit maximizing and selfish, because that's sort of the easiest assumption to make in many contexts to try and understand, and predict a lot of what happens. Do you feel like the insights from this research program have sufficiently been taken on board in economics? If not, where do you think that economics should go further in taking those insights seriously? What would you say is the state of play in 2025?
So this interesting question that we talk about at the end of this new book. Here's where we are. There are behavioral economists in every top economics department and business school around the world. There are behavioral economics papers in every top journal, virtually in every issue. So, and there have been lots of prizes. So at some level, things are going great, beyond my wildest dreams. On the other hand, basic introductory textbooks are almost identical to the way they were 30 years ago. If behavioral economics is mentioned, it's either in a chapter near the end or in little boxes that at the Economist newspaper they call these fun boxes, right? So there'll be a whole chapter on profit maximization in the firm, and then there's a box on the winner's curse.
Look at this one funny company that didn't do that. Yeah.
Right. Proving what how important it is to learn. So, and I'm sympathetic with that. I think it is important for people to learn the basics, and but no one has written a textbook that threads the needle, and it won't be me who writes it. But that's where we are.
What would you say to people who are skeptical about economics based on some of these points? I feel like there's sometimes a slightly simplistic set of criticisms of economics that build on your sophisticated work and the sophisticated insight of behavioral economics to dismiss the entire enterprise, right? Oh, these silly economists, they assume that everybody is rational and selfish and profit maximizing and individualistic. And that's not what the world is like at all. Therefore, we should just throw the whole thing out, right? Economics really is the dismal science that doesn't have important insights to offer. Look at how they make these naive assumptions about how humans work. That's not at all what human beings are like. Why shouldn't we go and study anthropology or history and other things instead? Now, of course, I also think that we should study history and anthropology and so on. But I take it that you still believe in the enterprise of economics and that economics has important insights to offer. What would you say to people who seize upon the criticisms that you've pioneered to dismiss the field as a whole?
Well, I think that, first of all, economics is an empirical field. And economists are, I think, almost without question, the most sophisticated empiricists in social science, and certainly the most sophisticated in using gigantic data sets. And if you think about things like central banks, what's the alternative? I mean, are we going to put anthropologists in charge of the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England? Now, that's not to say I think those organizations couldn't be improving. And, here's an example. Something that central bankers are concerned with right now is the so-called wealth effect. So stock markets have gone up, and so people are richer. Are they going to spend more? Now, one of my favorite topics in behavioral economics is what I call mental accounting, that people don't just look at their net worth, some big capital W in the model, wealth. They put it into buckets. And so if you ask me what will the consumption effects be from people being richer, I would start with, well, who has that money? The bottom third of the population don't own any stocks. The middle third only own stocks in their retirement plan, and because of mental accounting, they don't spend that money. That's in retirement money. They don't spend housing equity either. And then the very rich that own the vast majority of wealth. Jeff Bezos, was he going to get married again? Right? So maybe he'll make us another trip to Mars. But so I think there are behavioral economists in various places around the Fed that are interested in these kinds of questions, and we can continue to improve. But there isn't some other field that's ready to step up and start regulating securities markets and the money supply. I think what we need to do is continue to produce more sophisticated economists who can incorporate behavioral findings into the everyday job of running a government.
Richard, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It's a pleasure.